My name is Dr.G. Welcome to That's Unusual, my podcast uncovering the unusual stories behind the world's most interesting people. On this show, we celebrate what makes us different and how we convert those differences into unexpected opportunities. Welcome to That's Unusual. My guest today is Michael Cascio. He is a veteran media artist who has to his name 4 Emmys, 2 Oscar nominations, and a Producer of the Year. I seriously doubt many of us can say that. Having been an executive producer at National Geographic, A&E, Animal Planet, and many other well-known media outlets, he has graced us with such household shows and series that include Brain Games, Biography, Dog Whisperer, Crocodile Hunter, Inside 9/11, Breakthrough, and many, many others. In this episode, we get an exclusive inside peek into Michael's storytelling approach to producing award-winning documentaries, what the future holds for the evolving media industry, how his first job as a janitor at Wolf Trap helped define his signature perspective that shaped his career, and much, much more. As you listen to this episode, I ask that you reflect on your own unusual stories and unique qualities that can help open doors to unexpected opportunities. And so with that, let's get started. Welcome to the That's Unusual podcast. I have with me today Michael Cascio. I'm extremely excited to have him on the show. Welcome to the show, Michael.
Great to be here. Thank you.
So you and I have gotten to know each other on several different levels through our encounters over the past year. And I think you have a very fascinating background in the world of media and many accolades across the board in terms of some of the work that you've done. I would love for our listeners to really just get and start off to get to know a little bit about you. So if you could do the honors and maybe just provide a little bit of your backstory. How did you get started? What are you working on today?
Yeah, I was a journalist by trade and always was interested in journalism and a lot of other things too. But, Gay Talese, the author, always says that journalists are restless voyeurs. And I always enjoyed watching, whether it's politics or police in action or whatever. And so I was a reporter and a news producer and a news director and wanted to be, the big journalist and then kind of wandered into various other forms of media, mostly dealing with facts. And I just think that facts in life is interesting. I love fiction. But life itself is just so interesting. You couldn't make it up. And that's pretty much the way it is, for every individual, but also in the times that we live. In some ways, reality is much more interesting than fiction. So I went to school for liberal arts back when that was a popular thing to do, and then went to graduate school in communication and got a job as a reporter and then kind of worked my way up through the media.
So that's fascinating. I couldn't agree with you more in terms of, there's enough interesting stories within the truth and reality in the nonfiction world as compared to fiction, especially in today's world. So tell us a little bit about your journey. So you start off as a journalist, as a reporter. I know you've worked with a number of well-recognized media outlets. Tell us a little bit about, how you got involved with various media outlets over the course of your career.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. Before I was a TV executive, at A&E, ran Animal Planet, National Geographic, NBC. Before I was an SVP or an EVP, I had a number of jobs. That, like most people, you have a number of little jobs. But one was being a janitor at the outdoor theater Wolf Trap, which is outside of Washington, D.C., as you know. And they bring in performers and they need people to clean up after the performers. And I learned probably more about the working world being a janitor than I did later on being a reporter or being a television executive and seeing all the changes in the media. And, part of it is that as a janitor, you're invisible. People you think about it. You don't really pay attention to the people cleaning up around you. But I'm here to tell you, they hear everything that you say. And that's where maybe I learned to enjoy documentaries. I like eavesdropping on people and seeing what people do. And it's funny, people will say things around you and they think that nobody's listening, which is interesting. And also you learn, look, cleaning toilets prepares you for anything icky in the rest of your life.
Yeah, yes, sir, absolutely. And you've got a wonderful piece published in the New York Times talking about the story and the lessons that you've learned from your days of being a janitor over at Wolf Trap, which is a facility that I love. It's close by to my home. And, so I'd imagine that there's certain, as you talked about being invisible as a janitor, there's certain listening skills and certain lessons that you've developed and applied towards your career in media and journalism. Can you tell us a few about those lessons that you've learned over the course of
it's
those
funny.
experiences?
First of all, you have to deal with all sorts of people. And in the working world, I think when you start your journey, you realize quickly that, this is a job. This is not school. It's a job. And so I had a boss who was, by all measures, a very decent man, but also a very Southern conservative, borderline racist, frankly, but an incredible guy. And, for him, this was not a summer job. For me, it was a college, lark to have a summer job backstage with all the stars. For him, this was his career. He was the supervisor of the janitors. And so I thought, can this guy teach me anything? Well, a couple of things. He definitely taught me. At one point, he asked me what I was doing after summer. And I said, well, I'm going to graduate school. And he said, well, let me give you a piece of advice. Never turn down a chance to take more responsibility. Mm-hmm. And I thought that, that was like a leadership. You could go to MBA school and never really understand that. And yet in that context, it was clear to me, you can, that was like a thing that just echoed through the rest of my career, and I did well by that. The other thing I learned was you can't judge people by the way they look, because we're janitors. We're like scruffy college kids with T-shirts, and and we had some vague semblance of a uniform, a certain T-shirt we had to wear, but basically we're kind of scruffy. And backstage, there's a lot of classical music. Lots of classical music goes through Wolf Trap, and there was a famous conductor, Eugene Ormandy, who big maestro, very imposing guy who was the biggest dude in the classical music world. And my buddy, who was on the janitorial staff, happened to be an expert in classical music. And so after a concert one night, he asked Maestro Ormandy, who ran the Philadelphia Orchestra, backstage in his dressing room. We're sweeping up and cleaning up, and so he goes up to the maestro, and this guy looked like Trotsky, and with a broom. And he goes up to, my buddy looks like Trotsky with a broom. He goes up to this imposing Ormandy in a tuxedo and says, and Ormandy looks at him alarmed, like the guy's going to attack him. And my buddy put him at ease when he asked him. He says, "Yeah, I noticed that you took the repeat in the second movement, and most conductors don't do that." And Ormandy's tone completely changed. He realized, somebody who actually knows classical music and asked the question. And they had a really interesting discussion, but it was sort of like high culture meets low slob and comes to terms. And from that moment on, I realized that, people are people, and they just want to talk. Actually, that's a good lesson for a journalist as well. And it's also where I learned that if you don't speak up, you're invisible.
Absolutely. I love those lessons that you've shared within those experiences. I mean, so often we forget to just be very, highly observant of our surroundings and sort of those experiences that may not be part of our core career journey, but certainly have an influence in terms of how we move forward and how we build ourselves and improve on ourselves. I just love that story about your experience in your early days over at Wolf Trap and how that's bled into everything that you've done into the future. Let's talk a little bit about, the course after that. I know you've won a number of Emmys and Oscars around some of the programming that you've done for a variety of different broadcast networks, including Food Network and National Geographic, among a number of other, various stints that you've had as an executive over the course of your career. Tell us a little bit about, some of your most memorable experiences in working through sort of the traditional media system and developing breakthrough shows like Inside 9/11 and Breakthrough and a number of other shows that you've worked on.
After I was a journalist, and I was in Wilmington, Delaware, by the way, which where I covered Joe Biden, and I always like to say I covered Joe Biden when I had hair and he didn't, and he got at some point he had hair plugs, but he was a lovely guy, and so my journalistic career was there. And interestingly enough, in addition to the Wolf Trap story, I also clerked at the CIA because my dad had worked there, and they always hired the kids of the people who worked there because you were already cleared. And so for a summer or two, and that was interesting because I realized that all the fathers in the neighborhood and some of the mothers worked at the CIA, but we never knew that until I actually worked there myself. But I then went into, I went into the media, and after being a journalist, I went to a TV station in Philadelphia after being in Wilmington. And at that point, broadcast TV was still the big dominant medium. There was cable, but it wasn't much. And after a nice turn there, I thought, well, I really like this entrepreneurial aspects of television and programming and trying to do something a little different and having some freedom. And I could see that the people in the cable side were having more fun, even though the budgets were less. And the whole structure was different than broadcast. And so I jumped to A&E, which, if you remember, in the 90s was a fairly robust network that competed in some ways for the PBS audience with higher quality programming. And I really liked that. I liked the idea that you were going to go for a higher, there was a reason for your programming. And so we did a ton of documentaries, and I shepherded a series, the Biography series, which was on every night. And at that point, it became a phenomenon. And I was written about in every publication. I was on the Oprah show, talking about biography, and I did interviews. And because the show was a phenomenon, it was very successful. And we did biographies of everybody from, Abe Lincoln and Julius Caesar and Frederick Douglass, and to contemporary people from, Ronald Reagan and Frank Sinatra, even to Donald Trump. And this series was very, very successful. It's almost hard to believe. It's just 20 years ago. And we
forget at that time period. I mean, that type of programming was very cutting edge at that time.
Yeah. And it was cutting edge because it had depth. And so we did hundreds of documentaries, and I was involved in many that were really good and a whole lot of them that weren't. But there were some that, went on to win all sorts of awards. And there was one that actually went to the Oscars and was supposed to win, but didn't win the Oscar. So I'm a two-time Oscar loser. But won a ton of other awards. And for that, and also the documentaries that I did started another network called the History Channel, which is obviously very big. So that was a big move to go from people thought it was crazy. How could you move from broadcast television to cable? Well, the situation is very similar now because the cable networks are pretty much institutionalized, in my opinion. I mean, they're good and people watch them, but the real creativity is obviously happening in the digital world. Digital is doing to cable and broadcast what the cable networks did to broadcast 20 years ago. And the audience for digital media is growing, and there's a revolution going on. And so that's, I went on to run, after running A&E, I ran Animal Planet, which was an interesting experience. I did some work at MSNBC, and then I was head of programming at National Geographic, where I did some terrific work. Again, high quality documentaries and factual programs that won all kinds of awards and really gave me insight into the world out there. And since then, I've sort of been on my own, kind of navigating the contemporary media waters. But it's been an interesting journey to see how programming and how viewers are the same, but different, in the sense that the same things motivate the audience today that did 20 and 30 years ago, but the formats may be different and the forums may be different. I don't know if that makes sense, but it's fascinating to watch.
Yeah, it absolutely does make sense. And I want to explore a little bit further around this sort of evolution of media over the course of the years. We've gone from sort of broadcast journalism where it was sort of live, reporting on news and various topics. Then we sort of had this generation into sort of the cable verticals, where you started to have, cable networks branching out and focusing on specific type of content, but it still wasn't really real time. It was a lot of, pre-programmed material. And now moving into sort of this digital streaming world of Netflix and Amazon, where you get anywhere, anytime type of programming. I'd imagine that, the way we look at content creation and programming around these different types of, or sort of the evolution of media, would fundamentally change as well. Do you have any thoughts or ideas? And a lot of pundits have been trying to, grapple with this as well, in terms of what does the world of content generation look like in a world of social media and reality and user-generated content, and really everyone being able to create sort of micro content that can be distributed in a digital fashion. What's your take on, given this sort of migration towards digital streaming, how is that going to impact how we think about content and content production over the course of that change?
Well, a couple of things. One is on the production side, and you said it correctly. It's so user generated. Anybody can create a video and or audio, and a lot of the stuff is pretty good. So it's democratized the industry, and that is, really the big revolutionary change. In that and in doing so, the barriers to entry, that is, the barriers to the audience, are way low now. So, anybody can post a TV show or TV series, and obviously the vloggers, the video bloggers are out there and, getting millions and millions of hits. So that revolution is done. That's over. I think the impact of it from a production standpoint, we'll get to the other standpoint in a minute, is that things are shorter and lengths are less critical. You can be a really short Snapchat type things, or you can be a lot longer. On Hulu, they recently they took a Stephen King book, 11/22/63, and they made 10 hours out of it. So the limitations are, the gloves are off. In terms of what this means for the audience, I am, maybe because I've been around so long, the audience is motivated by the same things they've always been motivated by, which is what's new, what's compelling. Do I like those characters? I want to watch this because the situation is interesting. I want to watch this because I like these people. I want to watch this because I want to learn how to cook a souffle. I mean, there's the same motivations that people have always had will drive them to whatever medium is there. And, the screen could be the size of your thumb, or it could be the size of, a wall in your living room. But I think the same rules apply. And I guess that's arguable, but the people I've talked to on the digital end say, will pretty much say that, but maybe not in so many words. There's a reason why I Love Lucy, a sitcom from the early 50s, is still funny today. It's in black and white, low tech, shot on with low tech cameras compared to today, and there's no virtual reality, but it's just funny.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, our behaviors around consumption have changed. I like to sort of call this generation the 140 character generation, because the attention spans have diminished to such smaller time frames as compared to what we're typically used to in sort of prior media channels that we've consumed. So today, are you looking at, when we look at content production and programming, are we looking at chunking it up in smaller bits and allowing you to consume it at sort of micro levels versus sort of the long form content that we've been used to in the past?
Yeah, I think that's the biggest change, even though the motivation to watch may be the same, but the length is in fact much shorter for all the reasons. You're online and you click on something on Facebook. I'm not going to stay for longer than a minute, because I'm not in that mood. If I want to watch Star Wars, I'm going to sit down and watch it, but that's not what we're doing. So, but in general, lengths have been shorter. And in a bigger sense, the news cycle is shorter. So this is not what you asked, but the sense that things are disposable. An issue comes up and tomorrow it's all over the place, because of social media. Hillary Clinton makes a statement and it's everywhere. And and so the shortness has also kind of applied to not just an attention span, but in terms of our the disposability of something. What is hot today won't be hot in 2 or 3 days. So
I'd imagine that that's a lot of the fuel that's powering, Donald Trump's campaign currently as well.
Yeah. Oh God. Yeah. Yeah. He's got ADD in a way that that works perfectly with tweeting and his whatever that personality trait or defect is. It fits with the current the current ways that media run. And my Donald Trump experience goes back 20 years ago when we were doing the biography series on A&E, and we did a biography of Trump. And it was so well received. Remember, he's been a personality for a long time, so it got pretty good ratings, even though he's not exactly George Washington, in terms of historical impact. But we did contemporary people, and it was good, but it wasn't produced well. So we commissioned another biography, a second one, because we didn't like the first one, and so I met Trump at some point later. That was an event that we were having, and he found out I was a biography guy, and so he cornered me, and he said, I really like the interview I did in the first biography. Could you take the interview from that first biography and put it into the second one? Because I really think that would make a better biography.
That sounds very Trump-like.
It's crazy. I mean, I did 700 biographies. People either wanted to do them or violently didn't want to do it. But I had very few people that tried to tell me how to produce it for them, for their, and he was like trying to produce the biography. He was very, very serious. And I, apart from the ethical thing about, this, I was a journalist. People don't have that. I gave him points for the chutzpah, but that is, sort of what's happening today. He is very much in control of the media and wants to produce his own story and has done a fairly good job of doing that. I later got the wrath of Trump by being quoted in the New York Times saying something unintentionally nasty about him, but and then he really went off the rails. But it was just interesting that he was trying to manipulate the media back then so that he would look as good as he possibly could. Very, very, and I think that's exactly what's happened. And he knows he's good ratings, so the networks, and I fault them for this, during the primaries, they just gave him lots and lots of airtime without correcting anything and without, or maybe they tried to correct it, but really they didn't do a terrific job of that. And they just let him have the airtime. And, that's fine if you like him, but probably no other candidate got that kind of treatment.
Yeah, and it's interesting that he's been able to control his brand even years ago, and it's even more so amplified in today's environment. One thing's for sure is that the rules have certainly changed, and we're sort of learning in a very, a wide-eyed way in today's electoral process in terms of how media can influence one's trajectory. And I think the way we've sort of, built in media and embedded media within the sort of social network sphere, it's really allowed almost every individual to have their own media brand. They can tell their own personal story, for good or bad. I mean, I think in many ways, you can't quite validate or fact check, people that share various bits of media in today's environment. And I think that's, it's a little scary, but I think it's something that we're sort of learning over the course of time as we sort of understand how people develop and consume sort of these new content in the new media world.
Yeah, and it's interesting. It's a very good point, because I think that right now we're into the sort of Wild West, and I think the curation that the newspapers or the news media used to give, or what, the insight is missing. Obviously we don't have as many institutions that do that anymore. But if you take a look at the turn of the earlier century, like 1800 to 1900, like in the early 1900s, big cities used to have 4 and 5 and 6 newspapers, highly irresponsible. And,
yeah.
They didn't do a lot of fact checking, and there was a lot of crazy voices out there back then. And the world survived. So, it's not exactly the same as then, but bemoaning the fact that the institutions are not as strong as they once were. Well, something will probably come up to replace them, don't you think?
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. So you've actually taken a little bit of a turn over the course of your career now, and you've gone from developing and producing within the corporate environment of the cable networks and sort of getting your hands within the digital world a little bit. Tell us about what you're working on now with M&C Media.
Yeah, so I took the plunge and decided to be more entrepreneurial, but there are several areas where people need help, and in the entrepreneurial world that we live in, it's not unusual to bump into people who are doing similar things, and so you partner up, or I partner up with different people doing different things. One of the things is kind of basically straightforward documentary production, and I produced a film on the Munich Olympic massacre of 1972. To a lot of people, that's ancient history, but it really is the first incidence of modern terrorism, or Mideast terrorism, on a worldwide stage. And so we did a documentary. It's on the festival circuit. It's airing on PBS. And I'm very, very proud of that. We put that together with some people who wanted to help fund it, and I brought in a director, and we put together this terrific film. And I'm working on a number of other projects like that, which are the production end, which is pretty much, you produce stuff either for either a company or something, but as an independent, you do that. But I'm also advising networks and producers on various forms of television programming, or ways that they can improve their audience or meet the challenge of today. Just today, I got an email from a former colleague asking, how do I put Skype into a television program? How often can you do that? What will the quality be like? And how do you marry digital video to television video? Stuff like that, that I'm dealing with at a variety of networks, and with some producers who are struggling to meet the needs of the audience today. So they'll bring me in for everything from script doctoring and looking at their scripts to looking at their development. How are you developing a program that 10 years ago, 5 years ago would have looked like X, but now, because of all the things that you've just discussed or we've brought up, it needs to be this. And if you look at a television show, 5 or 10 years ago, it might look a little different. Sometimes they'll hold up fine, but the people need to know, how am I going to attract an audience? How am I, what's the marketplace like? And so I do a lot of consulting on that, because the marketplace is changing, and I've been there, and I'm in the middle of it now. And then I'm doing some entrepreneurial stuff that, if it comes about, will be more on the cutting edge of things. I'm looking at everything from the evolution of very local news, because obviously newspapers aren't as strong. So what can we do online that improves local news that people want to take in? And I'm working on some projects like that, and some other entrepreneurial things that it's a great time to be out there. There's so many different opportunities. I just don't have the time to do as many things as I want. But if you have the time and effort, ultimately you might strike gold. That's the fun part.
Yeah, it certainly is very exciting times. I'm sure you've probably seen a lot of the buzz around Pokemon Go and the popularity it's had in the marketplace in terms of sort of validating the interest around augmented reality. Are you having any of your clients, asking you about, what's the world of content production around virtual reality and augmented reality, and how that fits into the media world? Yeah,
it's interesting. There's a lot of discussion about it, and a couple of my colleagues have taken the plunge into that kind of production. And now it's interesting, because every production that is proposed to a traditional network, cable network, has to come with something that would address that. Okay, that's great. You have a television show, but what are you going to do for VR or augmented reality? And it's interesting, because now you have to have a plan, not just for a television show, but what's going to go viral? What's going to be the digital application? Can you do something separate for digital? Can you do something separate for VR? Is it appropriate for VR? It's the same that digital was 15 years ago. There's not a ton of money in that, but it's, that you're meeting a need. My personal feeling is that VR will always be a specialty act, and people like it, but it won't be the main course. That's an arguable point, I know, but you still have to address it. You still have to say, especially in the world of, and I deal a lot in documentaries that are not just historical, like the Munich Project, but they could be dealing with wildlife or nature or kind of an experiential thing, and that's perfect for VR. Where you're going into the jungle and looking, waiting for the elephants to show up or whatever. And that is, stuff that I'm just beginning to get into. And it's fun. It's fun to see that happen. The Pokemon stuff is interesting because that's a phenomenon. And it's like, it's swept. You could see people walking along the street doing it, and I guess there'll be something else in the next month or two.
Yeah, and I think, as much as that's centered around games, I think it does, to some degree, validate the interest around sort of the merging or marriage between our virtual world and our real world. And I think Pokemon Go certainly has demonstrated that particular interest in terms of the millions of users that downloaded it and use it. Certainly we'll see where that sort of migrates into the world of media and content production down the road. Certainly this notion of augmented reality and this convergence of, you talked about having certain use cases that might not be universal for everyone in all forms of content, but certainly, in certain scenarios, for example, in travel or history, and being able to take people and immerse them in sort of a historical environment or around a particular geography, there certainly might be some interesting use cases early on that could show some benefit around virtual reality and augmented reality in media.
No, I was just going to say, I think we've only begun that journey, and there's just so much that could be done.
I mean, your perspective is fascinating and certainly respected, having been someone who's been around the industry for quite some time, and really interesting backstory. I'd like to shift gears right now and ask you a series of questions that I ask all my guests, and it's somewhat of a rapid fire Mad Libs type of session that we'll close out with. So I will start with a statement. And if I could ask you to just finish off the sentence, whatever comes to your mind. So we've got about 5 questions here. And if you're ready, I'll start with the first one. The best piece of advice I ever received was?
From my janitorial supervisor, who said, never turn down a chance to take more responsibility.
And I think that's a great piece of advice that you talked about earlier.
Mm-hmm.
The one unusual habit I do on a daily basis is?
I am very particular about the fonts that I use when I am creating documents or emails, and I'll spend a lot of time correcting or adjusting the fonts or checking them out.
Why is that? Are you just sort of a visual guy who has to sort of see it in a certain way, or what do you think?
Yeah, I guess it goes back. My grandfather was a printer, and back then, you had to be. You literally, I think, would hold the fonts in your hand, and put them back when they had those kinds of things. And the visual. I just think that your visual impact, even when you're writing, is very critical. Whether you have serifs on your letters or not, and it says something about yourself.
Yeah, that's interesting. It's almost the equivalent. I used to when I was younger. I used to study handwriting. And you can almost tell a person's personality profile to some degree based on how they write, whether it's cursive or in print or forward slanting or back slanting. I wonder if based on font selection, if you could determine certain personality traits and characteristics from that.
I love that. That's a perfect analogy. Because handwriting analysis, people can go deep into that.
Mm-hmm. Although it's too bad not many people write anymore.
No, that's true.
If I had to write a book about myself, the title of the book would be?
My Biography and Biography. This is a biography series that I did for A&E. Would be something related to that, because I suppose I always tell people, this is a little morbid. If I died today, the first paragraph would be the guy that created the Biography series in the 90s, a momentarily popular show. But that would be somewhere. Or maybe the title would be from janitor to biography or something like that.
Okay. If you could invite 3 people over for dinner, dead or alive, who would you invite and what would you talk about?
I'd invite humorists like Dorothy Parker, maybe Woody Allen, and possibly George Bernard Shaw, who, as you know, a writer in the first part of the 20th century who did Pygmalion and some others, but very witty playwright who I think had a lot to say, but kept a sense of humor about them. And I don't know why, just because it would be funny. It would be funny and fun to hear people kind of talk and riff on each other and laugh. So that's out of nowhere. I hadn't really thought of that, but to me, that would be a fun evening.
Yeah, it sounds like it would be a delight. Last question for you. I am unusual because?
Because I watched a lot of TV and think that was actually very educational for my upbringing. And most people don't think that that's a really good thing to do.
Yeah, certainly true. And we all grapple with that question with our kids and how many devices they should actually have in their hand. But a nice balance is certainly good. So this has been wonderful. I'm so honored to have you on the show, and you've got such a fascinating story and perspective. So once again, thank you for joining the That's Unusual podcast, and it was a delight talking to you. Hi again, it's me, Dr. G. If you are still listening, I'm hoping it's because you enjoyed this podcast. If you would like to hear future episodes, you could really help me out by subscribing to the That's Unusual podcast on iTunes and leaving a review. It goes a long way in helping me get the word out from avid listeners like you. As a thank you, I will be selecting one new reviewer each week at random for a free private 15-minute phone conversation where you can ask me anything and get professional advice on your career or business to help you stand out and make a difference. Also, if you want to be notified of any future episodes, please visit that'sunusualpodcast.com and sign up to receive updates on new episode releases. Until next time, remember to always think unusual.